Thanks for joining us today on the Fuel Growth Podcast.
What is the right growth equation for your company? Is it pipeline,
Brand,
product,
customers,
employees?
Join us as we interview CEOs, entrepreneurs, and seasoned executives to explore what it takes to propel your business into growth. Welcome to the Fuel Growth Podcast, where we explore how to unlock the secrets to sustained revenue growth. Joining us today is Andre Yi, software entrepreneur, previously two-time CEO, board member, and now the Chief Product Officer of Foundry, a new subsidiary of International Data Group, or IDG, a global tech media, data, research, and marketing services company. Andre, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Clint. Appreciate it. Glad to be on this podcast and looking forward to our discussion.
We are too, Andre. I want to kick us off, actually, Andre. So you started your career as a developer, I understand. You've climbed up the executive ranks to become a thought leader in the marketing software industry. Can you tell us more about your journey to get where you are today?
Sure. My true origin story would have be that I'm an immigrant into a great country. So I actually started here. I actually came to the United States as a student from Malaysia. Ended up meeting my wife here and ended up staying here. So I came here not for I didn't stay for career as much as for love, true love, I guess, if you want to think of it that way.
Oh, he's a romantic at heart. I love it.
Exactly. So, but I did start as a software engineer and loved it. But I found my true sort of calling in sort of leading technology organizations. I love technology, but I also love the people that work in technology. So that was a great combination. And I've had a series of different jobs sort of initially just as a software development engineering manager, then a VP level. And I've been with 4 companies that have done an IPO in different areas, actually. One was in tax accounting software with a company called Best Software. Another was Landmark Systems, which was a systems management company. And then with a company called Saga Software, which was a spinoff from Software AG. And then probably the most successful was a company called Eloqua. It was, we like to think of ourselves as the pioneer of marketing automation.
I think we all think that as well. Yeah, you guys absolutely were. You created that industry.
Yeah. So we like to think that we were sort of creating a category. And so that was a great ride. I wasn't a founder. I joined when we were sub 15 million ARR, but grew that business over 5.5 years, part of the executive team that grew the business from sub 15 to over 100 million in ARR in 5.5 years. Took the company public, and we didn't stay out very long as a public company. We ended up being acquired by Oracle for a little less than $1 billion. So we didn't quite make the unicorn, but we were close. And so, it's been a great ride. And then I stayed with Oracle for, I was the group vice president of Oracle Marketing Cloud for less than a year, really, because I wanted to do the one thing I'd never done in my career. I'd been part of companies where I've come in at either 5 to 10 million in terms of revenue, and then try to get it to over 100 and scale the business. So I've done the scaling. I've even done the turnaround. I've never done sort of from scratch, just the idea, can you go from 0 to 10? And so that was the whole goal with Triblio. And it was a great ride. And we ended up, sort of merging or selling to Foundry. At the time, it was called IDG Communications. And I am now the Chief Product Officer for Foundry.
Excellent.
That's a great ride along there. And in there, you were CEO of Triblio, and you were CEO of another company before that, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Previous to that, I was in my journey, I was the CEO of a company called NFR Security. That was a turnaround. It wasn't, it was a company that had trouble. I joined actually as the CTO. I took over as the CEO. It was my first CEO job. And it was sort of learning, being thrown in the deep end of the pool, because it was really a company that needed a turnaround. successfully turned it around. We did a raise and turned it a venture raise, recapitalized the company, and we turned it around and sold it to Checkpoint Software, which is a large firewall and security company.
Right.
And so that was a good ending, but it also cured me of the desire to do turnarounds. It was very, very difficult.
That's where your gray hairs came from, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Well, in there, I'd like to dig into Triblio a little bit more, because not only is it the company that you were just CEO of, and I believe the company, you started it in 2013, 2014, somewhere around there?
Yeah, technically 2014.
Okay,
so.
2014. So not only is it the company that you've been leading for the past, 6, 7, 8 years, and then sold to IDG, which, by the way, huge brand, right? One of the biggest brands out there, IDG, but not necessarily in the software space. So I'd love to a little bit later to understand what Foundry is doing in the software space as part of the IDG group. But in there, the part I really like about the Triblio story is not only did you have to figure out how to drive growth as CEO, but your own product's purpose is to help companies grow, right? Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about Triblio and how it helps companies grow.
Yeah. So to give a little context, I started Triblio in 2014. At the time, we had a slide deck and an idea, and just that whole thing. We raised about $3.5 million and set off on our journey. I say that because we didn't really technically enter the account-based marketing space, which is where we ended up. As like a lot of startups, we started with the wrong idea or not the suboptimal idea, I guess. And we found our way to account-based marketing. And so we've been in the account-based marketing space since the beginning of 2016.
Okay.
So, it was I could spend another podcast just talking about how you find your way to product market fit, but I'll just leave that for now. Just to say, we're a leading account-based marketing platform. I think one of the unique things about us is we have proprietary intent data built into our platform, which allows you to identify and target accounts with the right buying profile. So we can actually tell you accounts that are showing interest in the market for your particular topic or for your particular product. Mm-hmm. We also allow you to engage those accounts with cross-channel campaigns. And then finally, we score those accounts and activate your sales team for follow-up action. That's in essence what we do.
Okay.
I think the big picture, when I think of Triblio is, we recognize that when you have a CRM, if you're a company, you have a CRM, our view is your CRM typically comes empty. And we see it as our job to help you fill that CRM with opportunities. That's sort of the big idea, I guess.
That makes perfect
sense. I love it. Fill up the CRM. That's great. Well, certainly, that's the world I live in is the CRM right. world. But I got to come back to you. Kind of brushed past it, but I want to come back to it if you don't mind, Andre. That moment in 2016 when you guys changed your direction and you then found the product market fit. I'm gonna if we could just touch on it for a moment. I'm gonna guess that growth was not hitting the goals you were looking for. Probably that's usually why you do that kind of shift, that pivot, if you will. Yep. What was the impetus internally? Was it somebody inside the company who had a new idea and was evangelizing a new idea? Was it a group of you that sat down and looked at the data and said, we need to go a new direction? But that moment of courage to take a hold of your product roadmap and turn it into a new direction, that's a pretty cool moment, or a pretty scary moment, or a pretty, it's got a lot of emotions wrapped. I'd love to hear your version of that story of how it kind of unfolded from a courage perspective, if you will.
Yeah. Cool is not the kind of the word I would use to describe that moment. I wasn't thinking cool. I was thinking desperation. I think that's actually strangely what I like about the startup world. I mean, I've done both. I've scaled up a company and I've started companies and I've turned them around. But I think what I like about the startup world is you don't have time to sit around. At least I think if you're a good entrepreneur, you don't have time to sit around and sort of stare at your navel. I mean, like I knew that it wasn't, we were not, we weren't achieving our kind of the market traction with the original idea, which I won't go into for fear of getting sort of like off track. But we clearly were not getting market traction. Sales cycles were long. I'm a big believer in like we had to work too hard to convince people to
Right.
sort of
Your elevator pitch took 3 stories.
No, it wasn't even that. I think it was difficult to convince people to buy into what we have, to be honest. And I think the way I look at it is, I think one of the mistakes I made was misunderstanding. I'm a big believer in lean startup. Everyone talks about lean startup, but one of the things about that was they say get the product out and learn quickly, which is absolutely true. But I think what I didn't realize is I thought if someone signs an invoice and says, I want to buy it, I viewed that as a product market fit signal. And I think that was where I misunderstood that a little bit. I've now come to believe the number one indicator of product market fit is not revenue. It really isn't revenue. Which I think given that this is a growth podcast, it might surprise people. It's really not. When in the early stage, it's not revenue. It really is usage.
Yeah.
Are people using it? Because what I found is that people will sometimes stroke a check for some interesting new tech, but then a month and a half in, they're not using it. And that's a problem in a SaaS model. So
thanks for sharing that, Andre. I want to switch over to, you mentioned earlier that you've gone through 2 stages of growth, first as a standalone company, and then as part of this exciting growth initiative with IDG. As a smaller standalone company, were your vision and values different than today since you were acquired?
I'd like to think that some of those same values are what we have today, but maybe I should say, as a standalone company, we had a certain set of values which I would articulate in the following ways. One of which I borrowed from my time at Eloqua. You talk to anyone at Eloqua, they'll definitely say one of the key sort of tenets was get it done and do it right. And what that means is we're results, performance-based culture, but we also believe strongly in how we get to those results, right? So it's not just about getting it done, which is great, but it's also doing it in the right way. So I think that get it done, do it right is part of the value that I imported into Triblio when we started the company. But there are also a couple of other elements we added along the way. Another core value that we have is what I might call positive candor. So you've heard I think there's even a book out there called Radical Candor.
Yes.
And we like that idea, except that we thought rather than radical, positive, it adds a better descriptor in the sense that we want all our employees to be candid about how they feel about their jobs, how during the process of collaboration, it's very important to be candid to get to the right answer. But we add the sort of the descriptor positive because, if possible, we want you to do it in a positive way. We don't want radical candor to be, which we believe in, to be an excuse for just generally bad behavior. So,
yeah.
So I think and then the last sort of value I would say is this ownership mentality. We want everyone to act as owners, and certainly as a standalone company, we everyone had stock options, and so they had a stake in our success together. So,
well, let's switch over to the people side of things.
Sure.
I know that we talked in the past about creating a company culture of growth. So I'd like to understand better on what you've done to build a company culture that supports your growth plans.
I think it was at Eloqua where I really learned and appreciated how getting the corporate culture right is vitally important for a growth company, any company, but particularly a growth company. I would say this though: when people think about culture, sometimes they think about different things. Two people can be talking about corporate culture and they can mean different things. For some people, when you say corporate culture, they're thinking happy hours, they're thinking good ethics with, positive vibes in the office, whatever it is that you might think. And I agree with all of that. I agree, especially with happy hours, right? So, but I think the point I would make specifically to the idea of a culture of growth is this: that culture has to be connected in a tangible way to the company's core objectives. And for most companies, that part of their core objective is growth, right? And I think and so you can't have culture be all these really, ethics are important, all these are important, but somehow in your culture you have to have you have to have some connective tissue to the idea of growth. If growth is a primary objective, then your culture should sort of speak to that in some way. Your cultural values should speak to that, and that's why I was saying earlier, I imported from Elico this idea of get it done, which is all about performance and cultures, but also doing it right. So that's an example of that. So having said that, I would say a growth culture, I think one of the most important things about growth culture is placing your customer at the center of your identity as a company. You're about serving your customers. At Triblio, one of the things that we realized at some point, not immediately, but as we started to build our business, was realize, we needed to be clear about who we are as a company.
Sure.
In fact, it came about because we felt like our marketing messages weren't resonating. And I spoke this to someone, our chief marketing officer at the time, and he says, "You know what I think? I think the reason why our marketing message isn't sticking is because we're changing it. And the reason we're changing it is because we're not clear on who we are."
Mm-hmm.
And I said, okay, so we got to work on that, right? So and part of where we ended up was that we felt part of our identity and is that our mission is about helping marketers help their companies grow. And we put that at the core of our not only our identity, but then as part of our culture. So there's a real sense of the customer, serving the customer so that they can be heroes in their organization and growing revenue is really part of our culture. And then the other part of our culture, I think the other part of a growth culture is also helping the employees understand the need for positive change. Because along that growth trajectory, you're going to find that roles change, organizational structures change, the way you do things change. And, growth brings about change. And an organization, we need to be
by its very nature, it is change, right?
Exactly, by very nature, exactly. So you need to constantly help us all remember we got to change. And then I think the last part of growth, building a growth culture is building a learning culture, right? Growing and that actually starts by hiring people who are naturally curious, I think, and who want to learn, who want to grow professionally and personally. And when you do that, it's amazing when you hire people like that and you give them the right environment. It's surprising how that then leads to your company growing. I mean, who would have thought that?
I heard you've already talked about one thing you would have done differently, or one mistake that you made. Are there a couple of other things that you've done, lessons that you've learned around driving growth during your career that you'd be willing to share with us?
Mistakes and lessons learned are two sides of the same coin, aren't they? I mean, like the greatest lessons you learn come from the biggest mistakes that you make.
Yes.
I think a mistake that early stage founders and CEOs make is they focus a lot on competition, because in a lot of ways we're sort of like, as business people, trained to do that. But I think when you're early stage, especially in a newer idea or an emerging idea, I think you want to focus on not so much the competition, but where the demand is or the future demand is, right? So don't focus so much on competition. Focus on the demand. What are customers wanting? What are customers' pain points? Or as someone once said to me, even if it's not a current pain point, what are the customers' near future pain point?
Yeah.
Sometimes they're not aware of it because it's not been it's just a dull ache now, but it's going to get acute in a year. And so this idea of not being obsessed about your competition in the earlier stage, but more around being obsessed about where the demand is, where the customer, sort of customer future pain point might be. The second mistake is more a little further along. I would say, I think eventually that and I would say there's a mistake I made. I think scaling your team means upgrading key positions. And the mistake I would say I made is not doing it earlier. And it's hard. It's a hard thing when you start a company and people come along on the journey with you to actually say, you know what, I really need to upgrade this position with someone more experienced.
Well, I got to tell you, Andre, we have really enjoyed this conversation today. Getting to know you has been just a lot of fun. And frankly, I'm looking forward to bringing you back to Fuel Growth in the future when you can tell us more about what Foundry's doing, right? So exciting. But, as we wrap up here, please go ahead, tell our listeners, where can they find you? Where can they learn more about you and Foundry? Where's the right place to go next?
Yeah, sure. I think the easiest thing is to connect with me on LinkedIn. And I think it'll be particularly interesting if they connect with me and just say they heard the podcast. And by the way, almost anyone that says that, gives a meaningful reason to connect with me, I typically accept. If they're not explicitly trying to sell me stuff, and just genuinely want to connect, I almost connect with it. Just about everyone. I'm not an exclusive. I know some people are very exclusive with their LinkedIn, and I'm not one of those. I'm like, you want to connect with me? I happily connect with you. So.
Well, I think that just speaks volumes to the type of person you are and the type of leader you are. You're a true inspiration, Andre. I appreciate your time today, and I wish you and the Foundry team a huge amount of luck. I don't know that you need a lot of luck because it sounds like you're on the right path, doing the right things. But with that, I will still wish you luck in the next steps. Thank you very much.
Lizzie, thank you so much. Clint, thanks both of you for having me on this podcast. Appreciate it.
We appreciate you.